All right, welcome back, Biology 241 students. So this week, we're moving on to our first chapter of Unit 2, our first chapter focusing on one specific system or particular tissue types, which is going to be the integumentary system, which is mostly composed of our skin, but as well as our skin, we have the connective layers underneath what is our cutaneous membrane, which is what is actually our skin, which is mainly epidermis, so mainly epithelial tissue. But underneath that, we have some layers of connective tissue, and then we have various accessory structures embedded within our skin that also play a role in this integumentary system. So hair, nails, etc. So we're going to talk about all of those things and how they work together to provide these 6 major functions to our body. So the integumentary system is very helpful. It does a lot for us. It's our main barrier between ourselves, our organism, and our surrounding environment, right? Since your entire body is covered in skin with these other accessory structures. So they're providing a barrier and protection. They are going to play a big role in regulation and homeostasis, keeping what we need inside, and keeping what we want out, okay? Including microbial invaders, etc. They're protecting us from damage from things like radiation from the sun. And then, of course, there's going to be a big responsibility in our perception of our surroundings, right? So sensation of things like pain, temperature, pressure, so that we're aware of what is around us, what we're touching, right? And can react responsibly. What's the right word there? React appropriately, I suppose. Okay? So a lot of different functions that are going to be performed by this one system. And so what is our integumentary system composed of? We have what we call our skin, which is our cutaneous membrane. So we have these highly stratified, so many layers of epithelial tissue that make up our epidermis, the most superficial part of our skin. We then have 2 different types of connective tissue making up our dermis, the underlying layers beneath or deep to the epidermis itself. We then have a separate layer of connective tissue, mainly fat, mainly adipose tissue, that makes up our hypodermis or subcutaneous membrane. And then we have all of these accessory structures. We have hair, nails, various types of glands, the nerve fibers, etc., that are all going to play a role in supporting those functions or providing specific functions themselves that our skin could not do on its own. And so we'll talk about all of that in this chapter. So again, our skin is our cutaneous membrane, and we have 2 large categories and then some subcategories under our dermis. We do have 2 distinctly different connective tissue layers in our dermis. But the epidermis is going to be that highly stratified epithelial tissue. So we'll have a layer of basal cells, stem cells that are producing a bunch of these keratinocytes, which are our mature skin cells at a very high rate. And as those skin cells are pushing more and more towards the surface, towards the superficial part of the epidermis, they are going to slowly die off and replace all of their internal structure with mainly keratin, a very fibrous protein. And that provides protection. Those cells are also going to surround themselves with a thick plasma membrane and some other fats and proteins to help with things like waterproofing. And so that's essentially what our epidermis is doing. We're producing new cells, and as they move closer and closer to the surface, they're slowly dying off, replacing all of their internal components with keratin and becoming these very thin, biologically inexpensive cells to act as our protection, our barrier with our external environment. The underlying dermis is there for support and nourishment. So we have a papillary layer, which is mainly areolar tissue, and a reticular layer, which is deep to that, which is mainly dense, irregular connective tissue. So lots of collagen and elastic fibers. And so that areolar tissue is providing nourishment. The blood vessels that supply the epithelia are going to be found there. The nerve fibers end there. Right? Epithelial tissue does not have direct supply from our blood vessels, right? So it's getting all of its nutrients through absorption and diffusion. And so those blood vessels that supply the epidermis are coming in through our papillary layer. The connective tissue, or sorry, the protein fibers, the collagen, and elastic fibers in our reticular layer provide some stretch and support, right, to allow us to be able to rub against the environment without just completely pulling off those different layers. So allowing for a bit of flexibility there, assisting in our temperature regulation, homeostasis happening in that reticular layer. And then these accessory structures provide variety of function. We have hair, which nowadays in our evolution doesn't really do a whole lot for us, but historically through our evolutionary path would have done a lot with thermal regulation, recognition, becomes a place for things like oils to be secreted onto, and a specific type of gland or apocrine gland would be secreting the our individual body odors, which acts or plays a big role in recognition of different individuals. But nowadays it's mainly just helping with our sensation, providing extra sense of touch, pressure. We have various types of glands, which are going to play a role in temperature regulation, excretion of waste, protection, and the nails, which are mainly just there for protection as well. So this is a closer look at the actual skin portion of this tissue. So we have our cutaneous membrane, which is composed of the epidermis and dermis. And so looking at it under the microscope here, you can see that that highly stratified organization, lots and lots of layers. We're going to have a single layer, so simple cuboidal epithelia at the base, which connects to the basement membrane. But then everything superficial to that is going to be squamous epithelia, stratified squamous epithelia. So those flatter, layered cells as we move towards the surface. And then, of course, our dermis with our two different types of connective tissue layers, our areolar tissue, making up the papillary layer, and our dense, irregular connective tissue, making up the reticular layer. So let's start with the most superficial portion of our skin, which is that epidermis. And our epidermis is organized into 5 different layers, or strata. So just like how we can have stratified tissue, right, the organization of that tissue itself can be separated into its layers. So from the most superficial, moving towards the base, we have the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Okay? So whichever way of organizing these letters and coming up with some sort of memorization technique works best for you, go for it. If it's from superficial to deep with CLGSB, or if it's from deep to superficial with BSGLC, whatever is going to allow you to make some sort of memorization technique for this, go for it. I know there's one that's brought up in one of the crash course anatomy and physiology videos that you might find helpful, but that's never stuck with me, and I can't even think of it right now as we're talking about it. But recognizing the order is going to be helpful, and then you can just associate that with logically, hopefully reasonably logically, what function those different layers are performing. So for me, logically, it makes sense to start with the deepest layer, our stratum basale, or our basal layer. That basal layer is where we're going to find most of the support and production for the rest of this epidermis. So in the stratum basale, you would have your basal cells, your stem cells that are going to be producing more and more keratinocytes. And as I mentioned earlier, keratinocytes are the mature skin cells. And they're named that because they are mainly there to produce a protein called keratin. And that same protein is what makes up the structure of your nails and hair. It just gets slightly modified into a different type of keratin. We have loose and dense keratin. And so dense keratin is what makes up that structure of our hair and nails that has a much denser, harder structure to it, or it's often also called hard or soft keratin. And then soft keratin is mainly what makes up like our skin. So these keratinocytes produce keratin, and they are being produced in that basal layer by the stem cells. Also in this base layer, we have melanocytes, which are going to provide a different protein, the protein melanin, which acts as a pigment, will provide some protection from the UV rays from the sun. And then we have tactile cells, our Merkel cells, which are what are going to innervate the various neurons, nerves that underlie the epidermis within the dermis, and provide that sensation of touch, temperature, and pain for us. So stem cells, melanocytes, and tactile Merkel cells are what you would find in that basal layer. And the basal layer is the only strata of our epidermis that is not squamous epithelia. The basal layer is going to be simple cuboidal epithelia. They have more of that round cube-like shape. But then all of the keratinocytes moving superficially, moving beyond this towards the surface, are going to be stratified squamous epithelia. So next, moving up in our stratum spinosum, these keratinocytes are going to start making connections with neighboring keratinocytes. We want to provide some separation as far as what is deep to our epidermis versus the environment. So we don't want things to be simply passing in between these cells, either getting into our body or getting out of our body. So these keratinocytes are going to be creating desmosomes, that cellular superglue with their neighboring cells, and some branching extensions of the plasma membrane called granules, created by those protein fibers. So the stratum spinosum is there for connection. These keratinocytes are starting to create a connective network with each other. Then moving up, and the stratum granulosum, this is going to be the highest level of keratin production, essentially. This is getting ready to become what we typically think of as skin, the superficial part that easily flakes off all those dead cells at the top. So in the stratum granulosum, you have a very high production of those keratin protein fibers. We're also producing a modified version of that keratin called keratohyalin, which is going to help with some of that waterproofing, or it's not completely waterproof, but prevents the free movement, the free osmosis of water. And then as they are moving out of the stratum granulosum, these keratinocytes are going to start to die. So once they have produced a high amount of keratin, the plasma membrane is going to get larger, so they're also adding more lipids, more cholesterol to the plasma membranes of those keratinocytes, and then their nuclei and all the organelles are going to start to die and break apart and be removed, eventually to completely be replaced with keratin and membrane. So as they move out of the stratum granulosum, those cells are basically just membranes full of keratin proteins. The stratum lucidum, our next superficial layer, is only found in thick skin. So that's the skin that we have on the palms of our hands and the bottoms of our feet. So this is not present in a majority of your epidermis. It's only found in those two areas on the human body. And this appears as a glassy layer under a microscope. And as far as its function, it seems to just act as extra support in connecting the stratum corneum to the stratum granulosum, since there's a lot more friction in those two areas, since those are mainly how we're physically interacting with our environment. We're grabbing things with our hands, we're walking with our feet. So there's a bit more of that friction and stress on those areas, and the stratum lucidum seems to help with that connection, keeping the stratum corneum connected to the stratum granulosum. But you only find that in thick skin. You won't find that in the rest of our epidermis. And then lastly, our most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. And so this is 20 to 30 layers of stratified squamous epithelial cells, those dead keratinocytes that easily flake off. And that's what makes up a majority of the dust in our rooms and in our houses. It's just our dead keratinocytes that have flaked off of our stratum corneum. So it provides physical protection, provides a buffer from radiation like UV rays. Right? They have to travel through all of those layers of squamous epithelia, those dead keratinocytes, before they can reach our living cells and potentially damage the DNA, lead to mutation and potentially cancer. Right? So it acts with protection that way. They have that extra plasma membrane and supportive lipids like cholesterol that assist, and the keratohyalin that assist in waterproofing, so preventing free water loss. And so yeah, altogether, those various layers make up our epidermis. So Starting from the bottom, stem cells, sensation, and melanocytes providing pigments. Moving up to our spinosum, we're creating connections between neighboring keratinocytes. Into the granulosum, keratinocytes are producing a bunch of keratin and starting to die off, replace all of their organelles with just keratin protein and larger plasma membranes and cholesterol. Stratum lucidum, only present in thick skin, helps with that, with connecting the stratum granulosum to the stratum corneum. And then our most superficial layer, the stratum corneum, is just many, many layers of those dead connected keratinocytes. So besides having one extra strata or one extra layer, our thick skin is also unique in that it has these ridges that you don't see on the rest of your skin, right? What makes up our fingerprints or footprints, or not, I guess not footprint, we don't really talk about it that way, but the bottoms of your feet do have these same ridges that we associate with our fingerprints. And this isn't because of the stratum lucidum. This is just because of the way that the epidermis is connected to the dermis beneath it. It allows for the ridges of the papillary layer of the dermis to make it to the surface. So those ridges end up showing on the surface, creating these folds. I don't fully understand why or how that is able to happen, but it does. So we get these epidermal ridges from the papillary layer of the dermis, making it all the way to the surface of our epidermis. Thick skin does not have any hair, so you won't find hair follicles, right? Because that would just kind of get in the way with what we're trying to do with interacting with our environment. And that's basically it. But again, you only find thick skin on the palms of your hands and the bottom of your feet. And so for a majority of your skin, you only have 4 layers: basale, spinosum, granulosum, and corneum. Thick skin is the only one with the stratum lucidum. And so moving deep to our epidermis, we have our dermis. And the dermis can be separated into its 2 different connective tissue layers. So we have areolar tissue, which makes up the papillary layer. And the papillary layer is named because of its characteristic papillae. So all these ridges, which is what makes the ridges of our fingerprints. Right? These are called papillae, each of those ridges there. And again, this is areolar tissue, so a somewhat loose connective tissue network with a more liquid matrix, right? And within the papillary layer, we have all the blood vessels that are going to supply the epidermis. Again, they don't penetrate into the epidermis. Epithelia don't have blood vessels within it, but the nutrients from these blood vessels are what are going to diffuse or be absorbed into the epidermis. And so those blood vessels come from the subpapillary plexus. So the plexi is the branching network of capillaries and veins that are going to supply the surrounding tissue. The subpapillary plexus supplies the papillary layer and the epidermis. And again, this is areolar tissue. Deep to the papillary layer, we have our reticular layer, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. So this is mainly collagen and elastic fibers. So this is going to provide a lot of that flexibility and support to those superficial structures. And so the reticular layer is being supplied by the cutaneous plexus. This is also where we get the branching of our major nerves into smaller nerve endings here. And then deep to our dermis, papillary layer and reticular layer make our dermis. We have our our hypodermis or our subcutaneous membrane, which is mainly adipose tissue. Here's a closer look at that reticular layer. Again, mainly collagen fibers and elastic fibers. And so the major difference between those fiber types is that collagen provides strength, whereas elastin or elastic fibers provide more of that flexibility. They have more give, stretch, and snap to them. So collagen is there for strength, elastin fibers for flexibility. And although these look kind of like crossing and unorganized in this image here, the collagen fibers do tend to, or do end up organized into these parallel strings with how they are connected end to end. And those parallel arrangements make up what we call the tension lines of the skin. And so this is showing on average how your collagen fibers in your dermis are going to be organized. They end up creating these strong parallel lines that are longitudinal at the limbs, that are transverse around the neck and trunk, and then create these at different angles, these circles at different angles within the face. And these tension lines have some application not only to evolutionarily, like functionally, they are organized in this way to align with what seems to have been, and typically is, like typical tension. So how our skin typically is interacting or rubbing against the environment. So to provide that strength in the directions that you would typically be experiencing tension. And medically, we see this play a role in our wound healing. To wrap it up nicely, these tension lines play a big role in wound healing. So collagen, you could think of like a rubber band, a really strong rubber band. And if you stretch a rubber band end to end and you cut it in the middle, those middle pieces are going to snap towards each end. So in the same way, if we have these lines of collagen fibers, this network underlying the skin, if you were to interrupt that network by cutting it in the center, those collagen fibers are going to snap back towards either end of where they are connected, thus pulling that wound and making it wider. So cuts along the skin that are perpendicular or go across these tension lines are going to make that wound open up larger, meaning it's going to take a longer time to heal, and are also going to be more difficult to repair because recreating those collagen networks takes more work than simply just building more epithelial tissue or supporting cells around those collagen fibers. So perpendicular cuts to these tension lines, anything going across a tension line, is going to make that wound larger, take longer to heal, and is much more likely to scar. And a scar is just the dermal tissue, the dermis, showing up through the epidermis, or there may be no epidermis at all. There may be no epithelia there, and it could just be your collagen network showing through. Whereas lines or cuts that are parallel to these tension lines are going to be much quicker to heal, much more likely to maintain their original structure. Right? They're not having that snapped back, pulling the wound larger, and they're much less likely to scar because that collagen network is still mainly intact. Right? It may have been separated, but it's still end-to-end connected, so it can easily just come back together. So tension lines, pretty cool. Like I said, deep to the dermis, we have our subcutaneous layer or hypodermis. Either term could be used interchangeably, which is mainly adipose tissue, mainly adipocytes, our fat cells. And 80% of the fat in your body, on average, is lying in your hypodermis. Okay? And so this is providing thermoregulation as a part of homeostasis, and keeping heat inside or keeping heat out, and protection. Okay? As a buffer there, as well as energy storage. Our cells use fat as our primary energy source at rest, and we can store our fat in these adipocytes. So adipocytes, these fat cells, are really just one large vacuole, essentially, stuffed full of triglycerides, stuffed full of fat for us to access later as a source of energy. And so something unique to our integumentary system is pigmentation, or at least as far as the regulation of pigmentation. Because you have some pigment in other parts of your body, right? Your red blood cells have pigment in them. Your organs have, various color to them because of other pigment type proteins, but our sorry, I'm getting kind of losing myself a bit here. Our integumentary system has this variation in pigmentation through two different types of this protein, melanin. So melanin is a pigment protein. Any pigment is going to provide color based on what wavelengths of light it absorbs or what wavelengths of light it reflects. And melanin can come in two types. So the melanin that we are most familiar with or see most often is eumelanin, which produces a brown or black coloration. So this is what is associated with the tanness of our skin. And most of the coloration we see in our hair and eyes on that like blonde to dark brown spectrum or black spectrum. Pheomelanin is a different type that tends to produce red or yellow coloration. So you see this more in light colored skin and in red hair. That would be from pheomelanin. And the major evolutionary function that this provides to the body is protection from UV rays from the sun. Right? The UV rays from the sun are radiation. They can penetrate deep through multiple layers of cells. And if they make it to living cells and into the nucleus, they could potentially damage the DNA of that cell. And if there's damage to that DNA, that's going to cause a mutation, which could potentially lead to the formation of a tumor in cancer or other dangerous proteins that are being created now since those genes have changed. And so we want to protect our skin cells, protect all the cells underlying our skin from that radiation. And these different types of melanin provide that. They are absorbing solar rays, those UV rays, instead of allowing them to just completely transfer through. And so human populations that evolutionarily we're spending time or are from areas closer to the equator, which has the highest amount of exposure to the sun, are going to have more active melanocytes. They are producing higher amounts of melanin so that melanin is completely covering the nuclei of these epithelial cells and even spreading out further throughout that cell to better protect the underlying dermal cells to serve as protection against UV radiation and protection against mutation. The farther you get from the equator, the lower the intensity of light, the less UV radiation you are exposed to. And so the lower your need for melanin, the lower your need for protection is. So lighter skin is typically due to having an evolutionary background in areas far from the equator, and darker skin tone is due to having an evolutionary connection to communities closer to the equator, right? To protect from that UV radiation. But differences in coloration do not stem from different numbers of melanocytes. On average, the number of melanocytes that each individual has in their skin is generally the same or in the same range. The coloration comes from the activity of those melanocytes. So the genes that code for that melanin protein are just more active. So your melanocytes are producing more melanin than someone with lighter skin or lighter hair color. And so here you can see a major difference in simply just the production of melanin, right? The genes within these cells are the same, but vitiligo specifically is an autoimmune disorder where your immune system cells are recognizing the melanocytes or the melanin protein as an invader and destroying it in different areas of the skin. And so you see these patches where they are simply lacking pigmentation. There is no melanin there, creating this patchy color. This doesn't really have much of a functional detriment to the human body besides increased exposure to UV radiation, but it's mainly just an aesthetic thing. Right? There's just no pigmentation. Right? So although melanin providing protection from the sun is great as far as preventing mutation and damage, you don't want to have an overproduction of melanin. It isn't beneficial for everyone to have a high production of melanin and to have dark skin, protection from UV rays, because your skin also uses that UV radiation, or using is a rough word there, but that UV radiation from the sun helps our body in the production of vitamin D. And we'll talk much more about the importance and the impact of vitamin D as we move into our chapter on the bone, so chapter 6, osseous tissue, next week. But vitamin D is a steroid compound, so very similar to cholesterol. And our skin cells, our epithelial tissue, has extra cholesterol that was produced to help with that waterproofing of our keratinocytes. And so the UV rays from the sun can modify that cholesterol into a steroid precursor for vitamin D. So calcitriol is mature vitamin D. Cholecalciferol and its intermediary product, these are not active versions of vitamin D. These are the subversions that are the substrates that will eventually become our active calcitriol. And calcitriol is really important for stimulating the absorption of calcium and phosphate, which are both make up a majority of the matrix of our bone. They make up the hydroxyapatite crystals that make up a majority of the mass of our bone, or the structure of our bone anyways. And so you don't want to block all of your exposure to UV radiation, because that is beneficial to us in helping us produce our own vitamin D. And I just recently added this slide in here, but I think I'm going to save this and we'll go further into, distance from the equator and how that impacts vitamin D production, and that application for us living north of this 40-degree longitudinal line in Seattle. I'll talk more about this in the next chapter when we talk about bone. But again, vitamin D is connected to our bone because vitamin D helps us absorb calcium and phosphate. And calcium and phosphate make up a major part of the structure of bone. So if you have a vitamin D deficiency, such as with the disorder rickets, you end up with these weak, wobbly bones that end up causing them to start bending under the weight of your body because they no longer have the structural support they need to maintain their original shape. So that's where I will stop this recording, and I will pick up in the next one talking about accessory structures and wound healing.